Last week I mentioned a battered old family wardrobe which we had when I was a child, and the marks on the wardrobe that my mother used to make to record how much we'd grown from one birthday to the next. Spiritual growth, we reflected, like physical growth, is usually rather a slow and steady affair, and that's as it should be. But every now and then, many Christian disciples experience something of a growth spurt. Their faith becomes significantly more real to them, often coinciding with a crisis in their lives, whether of a happy or troubling kind or both. So how might we recognise those crises and harness them so as to help us grow more fully into the faithful, fruitful, joyful people whom God has created us to be? Moments of revelation, what we might call epiphanies or light bulb moments, often lie behind those growth spurts. And last week we focused on seeing visions and dreaming dreams, an experience which drives the storyline of the book of Acts and which remains remarkably common today, even among Christians who wouldn't use that language but would speak more naturally of hunches, intuitions, or maybe practicing the presence of God. But the storyline of the book of Acts also gives us many examples of epiphanies occurring when the word of God is taught and proclaimed. This is the word, writes St. Luke, that makes our hearts burn within us. This is the word that cuts us to the heart. This is the word that spreads, advances and gains adherents, the word that grows mightily and prevails. It is no wonder that the apostles, faced with the difficult question of what they should prioritise between so many different competing demands, came to the conclusion that their calling was first to prayer, that is, leading God's people in public worship, and secondly, quote, to serving the word. And so the book of Acts includes a whole series of sermons and speeches from the lips of Peter, Paul and Stephen in particular, along with some other more intimate encounters where the word of God is taught and proclaimed. The lovely story of Priscilla and Aquila, for example, who took Apollos aside to fill in the gaps in his Christian understanding. Being nourished by the word of God, that for Luke was the Old Testament, together with the apostles' testimony of all that Jesus had said and done, was fundamental to the slow and steady growth of those early Christian disciples, just as being daily nourished by the Scriptures is fundamental to our spiritual growth today. But there are also crisis moments that we read about as the Word of God springs to life in the most powerful and often provocative of ways. Those crises can result in very different outcomes. Peter preaches a great sermon and 3,000 people are baptized. Stephen preaches a great sermon and ends up being stoned to death. But even Stephen's martyrdom, tragic though it is, bears amazing fruit when viewed with the benefit of hindsight. In particular, it provokes a personal crisis in the heart of a young man called Saul, whose subsequent road to Damascus experience ranks as probably the most unlikely and certainly the most momentous growth spurt in all of Christian history. This Saul, of course, goes on to become a great teacher and preacher himself, skillfully adapting his message to different audiences, whether Jewish or Gentile, simple or sophisticated, and living out a radical mission principle that he is to be all things to all people, so that by all possible means he might save some. Among the Jews, he demonstrates how Jesus is the fulfillment of the Hebrew prophets. Among the Gentiles, he demonstrates how Jesus is the fulfillment of the pagan philosophers and the cries of the human heart. And meanwhile, he writes letters to the churches that have gone on to shape the course of human history. If Jesus is God incarnate, or perfection incarnate, Paul is in many ways the gospel incarnate, or grace incarnate. His remarkable backstory as a former persecutor of the church, stopped in his tracks by an appearance of the risen Christ, just can't be ignored, even by those who mock his small stature and unimpressive speaking style. In the 5th century, a man comes across one of his letters and hears a voice behind him saying, "Take up and read," which he then proceeds to do. More than 1,000 years later, another man reads the same letter and writes of how it became for me the very gate of paradise. Move forward another couple of centuries, and a third man picks up the letter only to find his heart strangely warmed. Paul's epistle to the Romans in each case, bringing about the most radical of growth spurts in the lives of St. Augustine of Hippo, Martin Luther and John Wesley. And how about us? When were our hearts last strangely warmed in our reading of the Scriptures? What parts have they played in our own spiritual growth? Where have they provoked us, challenged us, cut across our cultural assumptions, not least in the person and teaching of the extraordinary man, Jesus of Nazareth, who lies at the heart of them? Where have they comforted us, strengthened us, burnt within us, renewed in us a hope and a future? It's with those questions in mind that I'd like us to turn to my very favourite story in the book of Acts. Indeed, the passage on which I've probably preached more than any other. The story of Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts chapter 8, verses 26 to 40. As with last week, I put together a few questions which you may wish to ponder as you read it. And I've also suggested an Old Testament reading, which will help to explain the nature of the crisis that the Ethiopian was going through and the joyful growth spurt that accompanied his encounter with Philip. Just a word of introduction before we turn to the reading itself, because Luke, you may remember, begins his account halfway through the story, leaving it up to our imaginations what happened next. What we do know is that an important Ethiopian official chose to make the pilgrimage of a lifetime to Jerusalem and the temple that lay at its heart. Under the strict regulations of the day, his visit to that temple must have been severely curtailed, given that he was both a foreigner and a eunuch, both of which meant he wasn't considered a full member of the people of God and was only allowed to enter the outer court of the temple, the court of the Gentiles. That was, of course, the noisy setting of Jesus' cleansing of the temple a few years earlier, and one in which the money changers and market traders were no doubt back. While in Jerusalem, the Ethiopian had bought a scroll of the prophet Isaiah, but otherwise I suspect his trip must have been a real disappointment. And that's where Luke takes up the story. May God bless you and nourish you as you turn to that now.